So our final topic for this week's The Pub Test is looking to a part of the world that is not often spoken about in Australia, a little region called the Horn of Africa. So for those not familiar with the term the Horn of Africa, it's a peninsula in East Africa, the sort of east northern part of the continent, and includes countries like Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and some broad definitions stretch as far as sort of Kenya, Sudan, South Sudan, and some of them even include parts of Egypt, which is obviously well and truly not in the Horn itself, but connected to this region. Now, there's a few really interesting facts and figures before we dive into this part of the world. One of them is Ethiopia is one of, I think, only 12 or 14 countries in the world that's never actually been colonized. So Ethiopia has a very long sort of history of independence, obviously one of the regions in the Horn of Africa. Another couple of things there, in Ethiopia and in Kenya is where the Nile River starts. So we have the White Nile and the Blue Nile, which come together in Sudan or Somalia. Sorry, not Sudan or Somalia, I can't remember, and become the Nile River in Egypt. But interesting historical part of the world, the cradle of humanity, Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, Indian Ocean, all come into that historic part of the world. But why is the Horn of Africa making the news?
It is such an interesting part of the world, Neil, and I've been lucky to spend quite a lot of time in the Gulf. So on the Gulf side of the Gulf of Aden, places like the UAE and Oman and stuff. It's a really fascinating part of the world. But when we look over at the Horn of Africa, you're right, it's not really an area that we hear a lot about in Australia. And it was only, I'm going to say about 2 months ago, I had a phone call from somebody who said, Somaliland. And I was like, yes. I tend to focus very much on places in the Indo-Pacific, but this is interesting. Talk to me. And they said, well, have you heard much from the Australian government on their position on Somaliland? And I was like, absolutely not. So I had a little ring around and tried to find out what was going on, just around some people who are in the know and not necessarily experts in that region, because we actually have very few in Australia. There's one, I think it's the University of Sydney, who's like a Somaliland expert, but very, very little expertise in this part of the world, on that part of the world. Anyway, next minute we see that Israel has recognised Somaliland, because I don't think any other country does recognise Somaliland as an independent state. And Israel has come into the news and saying that they are. So obviously there was someone who knew that this was coming and was saying to me, what have you heard about this? And this is really interesting because if you think about the strategic position of Somaliland in the Gulf of Aden, and if you think about its natural endowments, so huge amounts of natural resources as well, Israel, you can see that there would be a strategic position there, like geostrategic position there, because you're basically opposite Yemen. And then you have the United States who are seeing this as a resource-rich region that if they could develop, potentially, Somaliland becomes very interesting. So this is it's sort of a new, I think it surprised a lot of people when this sort of started to pop up in the news, but then to see Israel take this very firm action. Now, I think the questioning around the Australian government goes to, well, would they support the US, who would probably support Israel in terms of its recognition and maybe even follow?
And it's an interesting part of the history if we look at this part of the world. So, let's dial deep into Somaliland now. Probably the only political podcast anywhere in the world talking Somaliland. But Somaliland was originally a kingdom established in the early 14th and 15th century. So it was its own country. It was a interesting part of the world, and it kind of did its own thing. Now, obviously, we had the era of colonization, and what is now Somalia and Somaliland was actually occupied by the British and the Italians. And part of the divide is actually because Somaliland was from the UK and Somalia was occupied by Italy, effectively, into the 19th century. And so the two countries have had this Somalia versus Somaliland love-hate relationship of, are they one? Are they separate? Are they Italian Somalia?
Has there been civil
British
conflict
Somalia?
between the two?
And there has been civil conflict for quite a number of years across the two countries, notwithstanding the fact that they share the same religion and things like that. But dealing with the sort of de facto state of Somaliland, it actually has over 6.5 million people. Largest capital and its capital city is Hargeisa, and it's quite an interesting topical region and part of the world. And to your point, it does have quite a few oil, gas, other opportunities that sort of locate it in the world, and has been involved in a number of different sort of historical political battles. Now, its GDP is very, very low, only $850, which is a very, very poor country by global standards, and its currency is the Somaliland shilling. There you go. But it's quite interesting that it's had its War of Independence. It had a Declaration of Independence. Its current constitution was written in 2001, and so it's largely been operating as this kind of de facto state for quite a while. And it's come into thought and conversation recently because of the recognition by Israel. And Israel's obviously fighting issues in that region with Somalia and other countries in that part of the world.
Well, if you look at the commentary around this, people are saying the number one reason is because of the Houthis and conflict with the Houthis for Israel. So it gives them a sort of a closer strategic positioning to Yemen. So that does make a whole lot of sense, and it kind of fits into that broader Gulf politics that's taking place right now.
And the other, if we're looking beyond the Horn of Africa, and I was very lucky, I spent a long period of time, technically it's outside of the Horn of Africa, but working in Rwanda and Burundi, sort of the headwaters of part of the Nile River, which meet with the other headwaters of the Nile River in Ethiopia and then travel through the region and come out, obviously, in Egypt. There's other tests of controversy in that region as well. So a number of years ago, Ethiopia, with Chinese support, built a massive dam on the upper reaches of the Nile River, such that Ethiopia now effectively controls the flow of the Nile River, which is pretty catastrophic for Egypt with its huge population. And Egypt's population, 95+% of it lives within a couple of miles of the Nile River. So an interesting part of the world historically with countries like Ethiopia, where a lot of humanity is said to have come from. Obviously, Ethiopia as well has never been colonized. We have Somaliland and Somalia. And then downriver from the Nile, we have Egypt. But a controversial and difficult region.
And it does interplay as well with other conflicts as well. So my understanding is that when you think about the Trump Riviera idea of Gaza, apparently, well, one of the theories is that Somaliland is also playing into that when it comes to Gazan refugees. So there are, when you look at, so I suppose for, the everyday person who kind of looks at these announcements like Israel saying, okay, we're going to recognize Somaliland now, there are all of these geopolitical, economic dynamics, strategic dynamics that play into that decision. It's not just some weird niche issue. It actually is sort of core and fundamental to these larger trends across the region.
And it's quite interesting that it hasn't popped up on anyone's radar up until recently.
Yeah, I did find that. I mean, I can tell you when I got that message, I was like, interesting. And I sent it around and no one, usually someone will say, oh, okay, yeah, I've heard something about that or whatever. Nothing, nada. So it kind of, if you go back to, I think it was our first episode where we talked about Venezuela and Latin America and these regions we don't pay as much attention to, this might not have been such a surprise to someone who was sitting in Israel, who was sitting in the Middle East somewhere else or sitting in the US, whereas to us in Australia, because we have less attention on it, we have less journalists there, we have less people reporting on these regions, we actually don't understand everything that's going on. So maybe a little study tour might have helped a politician or two if they'd been out to Africa.
Potentially. And the final thing that I find really interesting reading sort of a little bit about Somaliland and what is happening there is Freedom House, which is the international body that kind of ranks freedom and democracy globally around the world, argues that Somaliland has actually the most democratic country in the Horn of Africa and the only country that has actually built a democratic mode of governance from the bottom up with virtually no foreign assistance. So it actually talks about the fact that for the past 20, 25 years, it's largely been building, customary laws, traditional practices, a private sector economy, avoided some of the inter-rivalries that have happened in that region, and is actually from a very low baseline starting to rank as a potentially, democratic part of the world.
So that's really interesting because if you think about, so one of the reasons that people talk about in politics and geopolitics that, why is Australia so closely aligned with Israel, for example? And one of the key reasons is people say it's the only democracy in the Middle East, right? And we partner with like-minded democracies. So that's like a fundamental pillar of the relationship. And that's interesting because then if you kind of look at that region and go, okay, well, where are the democratic like-minded states? You might look at Somaliland and go, okay, this is this is a country or a place we can work with because our values and systems align in that democratic sense. So that kind of fits into this whole Western liberal democracy piece, even though it's, not part of the Western hemisphere. It's the democracy narrative, which is really problematic when the leader of the free world is then going and kidnapping the leader of Venezuela or another country. But you take my point, and that's sort of the system that we've been built upon since the end of the Second World War.
So it's an interesting part of the world, lots of complexity. The president and vice president of Somaliland, I would love to catch up with. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce their names, unfortunately, but I think it would be really interesting. Here's a country that is only officially recognised by Israel, but does have relationships with other countries like Taiwan and Sweden and the European Union, has set up a democracy in a region and a part of the world that isn't typically very democratic, and is really trying to make a parliamentary democracy system work, which is quite a curious part of the world. So I won't do a disservice in the pronunciation of the president and vice president's name, but I would definitely be up for whatever their local drink is, although given it is an Islamic kingdom, it probably wouldn't be alcoholic, I would say.
It might just be a nice soda with lime. Yeah, look, I think you make a really interesting point, but I've got to tap into something that you've been talking about, Neil, throughout this little subsection is we're like a really interesting part of the world. It's a very different and complex part of the world. Whereas for a lot of people listening, if you are from any country in Africa, you won't be saying, oh, this is a different and interesting part of the world. You're like, this is just kind of like life. And I think that we come at this with a very particular bias where
Australia's view of the world.
Right. And we met, in the Australia-India space. We've been very much focused on Asia as a region. And so as soon as we step outside of that, for us, it's quite different. But for someone else listening, it might be home or very close to home. So I think that we have to kind of acknowledge that we come with a very big bias here.
A bias and also sort of a viewpoint of the world that's
correct.
Australian.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always pub quiz test as I said, I lived and worked in Rwanda and Burundi for a period of time, and I'm yet to meet somebody else in Australia who has actually been to Burundi. So this is kind of my little pub test quiz of like who has been. But
that's a good one. Yeah.
A very small little country. And we were doing some Googling, or I was doing some Googling while we were rounding that out. It is a Somali tea is the traditional drink. It's called shahar, and a spiced black tea with milk. And I'll pronounce it wrongly, but Qahwo is the Somaliland coffee, which is cardamom and ginger. Ooh. So sounding somewhat chai-ish.
That's a bit chai-ish. That's sort of reflective of that northern part of the region, right? Like if you think about going across to sort of the Middle East and through, over to India, the spices and similar kind of
vibe and countries both Erin and I are very close to. And our final fact before we round out this week's episode is apparently it's tea by sea and chai by land. So it's called chai in countries where it was delivered by land and tea where it was delivered by water.
Yeah, and what you've got to be careful of is not just saying chai tea.
Which is TT effectively.
Yeah.
So there we go. So interesting rounding out the pub test for today is the topical sort of presence of Somaliland and how it cropped onto the agenda. And I'd definitely like to investigate it a little bit more and potentially visit. I think I'm visited about 80 countries, but Somaliland has yet been on that list. So who knows where we might be going.
And I think the thing is for us, and particularly with this podcast, is that there'll be more of this, I think, under Donald Trump's America, where we'll see these things pop up that perhaps we haven't traditionally paid attention to. I mean, the status quo has been entirely disrupted. So we will start to see these things and we need to learn a bit more about the world in the process.